When we look at the selection today from the Gospel according to St. Matthew, which is a continuation of his presentation of the Sermon on the Mount, we find, first of all, a part of the sermon that isn't usually emphasized. And we hear a lot about blessed are the poor, or blessed are the poor in spirit, as Matthew puts it. Blessed are the meek and those who mourn. We even hear a lot about loving our enemies, which is something we'll hear about next week, as difficult as that may be. But we don't hear so much about being liable to the hell of fire, or plucking out your eye, cutting off your hand, or not divorcing, even in spite of irreconcilable differences, so-called. In this passage, Jesus seems to have been making the law harsher and tougher. He seems to be drawing out the consequences of his previous statement that not a letter, not a stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished, and goes on to say how troublesome that may prove. Now, people have tried to interpret this in different ways over the centuries. Many interpreters focus on a basic understanding of grace that's given by St. Paul. So they see this rigidity as a sign, as a way of getting across the point that we can never really accomplish the law. So through understanding that, we're moved to turn to the grace of God in Christ. That was repeated by Martin Luther and has a whole tradition within Christian interpretation. Other interpreters have seen this rigidity as a sign of and limited to the expectation of a very soon to arrive dawn of the kingdom, end of the world, so that it's special effort for hard times. It's like selling all that you have and following a religious leader up to a mountain to wait for the imminent coming of Jesus, which has happened a number of times, particularly in the United States, to people who then had to come down from the mountain and deal with their unpaid bills, and wait till the next surefire, any day now, second coming. I don't really know what Matthew or Jesus intended here in some of this, and that's true really of any of our interpretations of the scripture, Orthodox or not so much Orthodox. Even the most obvious understandings are meant, I think, just to invite us into interpretation, to invite these ideas into our spiritual living rooms, to sit down and have a chat with them and see if we get along. But Matthew or Jesus could also be saying that the law really isn't more harsh or more demanding, but rather more interior than we usually understand it or apply it. Maybe more a matter of psychological or spiritual disposition than it is a call for a particular righteous or moral action or restraint of action. Anger is a really good example. Anger has to do with matters of the heart and soul, and it comes from places that are not really amenable to our will. But Jesus is saying we need to pay attention to the anger, because that's the source of the later murder, that if you deal with the anger, never may even appear as an option. The same thing holds true when applying this to the issue of lust. The same sexual behavior can be exploitive and abusive, or holy and gentle. It's the motive really that counts. It's the inner resolving of this whole complex of sexual drives and how they're expressed and with whom they're expressed that determines whether the same act flows from lust or flows from love. And that's what we're dealing with here. And I've thought a lot about what Matthew says about forbidding divorce, and Luke and Paul. Matthew's the only one who gives any excuse for divorce at all when he talks about unchastity. And it may be that this rule for marriage was a strictly applied, more rigid standard for the times in which they lived and which they thought was necessary, and that we, I guess, if you take what the church says, don't feel that way necessarily anymore and are more adaptable to the wanderings of human relationships. But it also, following this line of inner direction, may be a way of saying that the divorce is just existentially impossible. You can go through whatever legal forms you want, writs of divorce or courthouse documents or some, I think, hypocritical ruling of annulment from a bishop. But when two lives are joined together, they simply stay conjoined. They're one. They're part of one another, and there's not much you can do about it. I'm not saying that any of these are the only meaning in the lessons that we've read. But while we think of beliefs, of the law as things simply governing ideas or behaviors, Jesus may be guiding us here to a deeper and more complex understanding. It may be time. Maybe it's not time for adult food, but I think we're done with the bottled formula stage. Maybe we're into applesauce or pureed peas, or carrots, or something. Maybe a Cheerio here and there. The Bible's not a handbook or a user's manual for Christian life. It's not a sociological document. It's not a history book the way that we understand history today. It's not a textbook for natural or social sciences. It's an instrument, one of the greatest instruments in history of spiritual revelation. And just learning how to think about it and read it in that way can allow new dimensions to open up for us that then we can live out in our day-to-day world. We live in a fast-paced, fact-based culture that doesn't seem to have time for God. So, I think it's a really good thing that God lives beyond all time and offers us a variety of foods that will nourish and please us beyond our imagination, and calls us to the complex truth where we can begin, at least begin, to experience eternity. Thanks be to God.